if negation has its origin in the ontological category of nothingness, then the question is, where does nothingness come from? What is the origin of nothingness? Now, most philosophers don't side with Sartre here. Most have thought that negation and nothingness are purely categories of linguistic judgment. Using the word not is all that nothingness and negation amounts to. It's a logical category. They haven't incorporated nothingness into their ontologies. Now, there are a couple of predecessors to Sartre that he addresses. These are Hegel and Heidegger. They do include nothingness in their ontology. The problem with Hegel and Heidegger is that they conceive of nothingness as the total absence of all beings. So that nothingness is a complement to being. And there's a kind of symmetry here. Being here, nothingness here. But Sartre argues against this symmetry. Being is required as the support for nothingness. So this is what he means when he says things like, nothingness is on the surface of being. Being in itself, the fullness, the plenum that we discussed in the last video, has no need of nothingness. But nothingness needs being to support it as its ontological basis. Moreover, nothingness isn't merely the complement of, here's the totality of beings and here's the negation of all of them, nothingness. Rather, nothingness slips into being, little pockets of nothingness, like when we discover Pierre's absence at the cafe. That's a little pocket of nothingness within the wider conception of being. So nothingness lies coiled in the heart of being like a worm. It's in there. It's not over here being over here. Nothingness slips into being. So how does nothingness slip into being? Well, nothingness requires consciousness to slip into being. That's the point. Consciousness and nothingness are intimately related. It's only by having a conscious expectation of meeting Pierre at the cafe that his absence is able to come about. Furthermore, nothingness by its own nature can't act. It has no traction in reality in order to cause other things to happen. So nothingness must be brought about by a being. In order for a being to bring about a nothingness, nothingness has to be part of the being's ontological constitution. It would be impossible for a being that was full positivity to initiate an act that would bring nothingness into the world. As Sartre said, there would be nothing in being by which being could surpass itself toward non-being. If you have being doing more being things, you're only going to get more being out of it. There's no way for being to break into nothingness of its own volition. Just like an oak tree can only bring about more oak trees, being can only bring about more being. Hence, the being by which nothingness comes into the world must be its own nothingness. Compare this again to the oak tree. An oak tree is the being by which oak trees come into the world. But in order to bring oak trees into existence, the oakiness must be part of what the oak tree is. A cherry tree couldn't just suddenly choose to bring oak trees into the world. It would only be able to bring more cherry trees into the world. Similarly, the being that has nothingness in its activities must also be nothingness in its ontological constitution. And we've already seen that it's through uniquely human activities like questioning, wondering, expecting that nothingness comes into the world. So it's the human being that brings nothingness into the world. What is it about human beings that associates them with nothingness? Sartre notices that the human being is the kind of being that exists in the world through its projects. We have an ability to detach ourselves from the way the world is, to question it, to envision new possibilities, and to bring those new possibilities about. Right now you may be wondering, with all this talk of being and nothingness, you've got me confused. What is this video really about? Does it mean X? Does it mean Y? Does it mean Z? In that very confusion, you're doing what Sartre is talking about. You're questioning things, laying out different possibilities, considering the way things might be. So like the oak tree that in its oakiness just brings about more oak trees, when you do your uniquely human activities, you are bringing about more nothingness without really intending to. So what makes it possible for human beings to step back and question things, negate the way the world is, and put forward new possibilities. Well, Sartre has a very peculiar argument here. He argues that I have to be able to effect a break in being. I have to be able to insert a gap from the preceding past and the oncoming future, and to become conscious of that gap. So he says the condition on which human reality can deny all or part of the world is that human reality carry nothingness within itself as the nothing which separates its present from its past. Nothing separates the present from its past. No thing does. Only your consciousness is inserted in as a kind of awareness of this gap between the past and the future. Since consciousness involves being aware of oneself as a cleavage between the past and the present, it involves freedom. It involves being undetermined, being a gap between what the positive processes in the past and what's to come. So he says, freedom is the human being putting his past out of play by secreting his own nothingness. This is hard to wrap our minds around, but the idea is like this. The bit of consciousness that you have right now, in this instant, that is a gap of nothingness between the past and the future. That's what you are, most fundamentally, according to Sartre. Consider it this way. Your consciousness is not a thing. It's no thing. Beings are things. There's nothing inside your consciousness. It just directs you onto the being. And in this movement of transcending yourself into being, you are affecting temporality. You're moving through time. This is hard to get a grasp on because Sartre says nothingness is annihilated, meaning it's always terminating in being. That's the arrow of intentionality directing us onto things. Just as oak trees can only produce more acorns, the nothingness that constitutes your consciousness can only engage in negative activities. That's why you can't just think of a hippo and have the hippo appear. This is what Sartre means when he says nothingness is annihilated. When you look around and try to find your own consciousness, your own self, you just get more things. You might try to look at the brain, but that's just another thing. Or you might try to peer inside, but you're only getting more awareness of, say, your body. Nothingness disappears as quickly as it appears. The passage from past to future is constantly recurring. You can never pause the clock. It just happened again. Your nothingness was annihilated, and there you are, there's more beings. So you're constantly coming up and being put into the midst of beings.